Welcome to the Virus and the Voters, Election 2020. This is the April meeting of the Northern New Mexico chapter of New Mexico Presswomen, and we're meeting by Zoom, as you can see. I'm hoping that you're all staying safe and well during this COVID-19 crisis. I'm Kathleen McCleery. I work for PBS. I've spent more than 2 decades with the PBS NewsHour, and I'm joined today, as you can see, by Brian Sanderoff. Brian is a pollster here in Albuquerque. He's president of Research and Polling, Inc. in Albuquerque. He's the pollster for the Albuquerque Journal, and he's a political analyst for KOAT TV, the ABC affiliate. We asked our members to submit some questions, and some of you did, and I'm going to incorporate those. And Brian, I want to start with the NBC poll that shows that 2/3 of Americans are really worried about the impact that the coronavirus might have on the upcoming elections. And so I'm wondering, are you seeing the same thing here in New Mexico? Or people worried about standing in lines, handling ballots, touching screens?
Absolutely. You know, here in New Mexico, we still haven't reached our peak of new COVID-19 cases. And we oftentimes see new hotspots. This week it's San Juan County and McKinley County. Which counties will it be next week? So people are very worried about the virus, very worried about going outside. And think about what happens when you go vote in person. You receive a paper ballot, you share writing and marker materials with other voters. You vote in a small little cubbyhole booth where perhaps 100 people have been in there before you. And so it can be stressful to go and vote on election day in the polls.
So if you don't go and vote in person on election day, then you have to vote by mail. And the Supreme Court here in the state of New Mexico actually rejected a proposal to have an all mail-in election. In the course of it, they did that because the legislature, they said, would have to approve it. But the Chief Justice, Judith Nakamura, actually wrote, it's indisputable that in-person voting poses a substantial health risk. So one of our members, Ann Hillerman, asked, if everybody's voting by absentee, how would that influence the outcome, particularly in the primary?
Well, you know, voter turnout in Democratic and Republican primaries is typically very low. Usually about between 1/4 and 1/3 of people participate in the Democratic primaries. So I see no reason for that to change. I think turnout will be low. But what's going to change is the mix, how people go about voting. Rather than more people voting in person earlier on election day, we're going to see more people vote absentee through the mail. In fact, in that court case, the Supreme Court ordered the Secretary of State to send out reminders to all voters about how to go about voting by absentee ballot. It's a lot easier than it used to be. You can now go online and actually request a mail ballot that way, and that's what we're encouraging people to do. Now, the lower the turnout, the higher the percentage of people who vote are over 50 years old. So those candidates who have the support of the older voters will do better in this primary election. And those campaigns that figure out an effective way to get their voters to actually get the ballot through the mail, that's like money in the bank. Those are supporters that they don't have to worry about getting to the polls on election day. So there are a lot of things the campaigns can do to encourage people to vote by mail. Those who do it best will have a better chance of winning.
So what prompts people to vote are the issues. What do I care about? So what is it that people are caring about during this particular crisis? Is it healthcare, or is it the economy, or is it leadership in a crisis? What makes a difference?
Well, I think people's lives have been turned upside down by this virus. I think people are concerned about their jobs, their health, their security, their families, what's going to happen with their parents and their grandparents. People are more concerned right now about real life issues affecting them as compared to technical policy pronouncements of candidates. So I think that candidates are going to have to get real. Also, I think the candidates that exhibit leadership, the candidates that basically gain the trust and the confidence of the voters, those are the ones who will succeed during this very unusual election. People are in a crisis. They want candidates who they feel comfortable and secure with at this time.
So leadership brings us to a question that Ann Hillerman asked about whether or not this could really end up being a single issue election based solely on the incumbent, President Donald Trump's handling of this crisis.
Well, I think one issue that's emerging that's related to the crisis, and especially in the next weeks and months to come, is this whole issue about when to bring the economy back online, when to soften the stay-at-home orders. And I think this will become an issue. We're seeing Democrats a little more prone towards stay-at-home in their policies, and Republican leaders more to opening things up sooner. So that will be an issue. But I think that when it comes to the president, you know, if you think about it, during times of crises, people tend to rally around the president. If we think about George Bush and 9/11, I think his approval rating went up to 90% during the 9/11. So here, I think President Trump had a missed opportunity. Had he used this time to try to build beyond his base of supporters and try to bring in a new group of people, I think he would have had the chance to increase his approval rating significantly. It's funny, this president has had pretty much the same approval rating from the day he came into office till today. Sure, it varies by 1 or 2 percentage points up and down here and there. But could this have been a time for Donald Trump to pull a George Bush and get his approval ratings up to 70%? Instead, he seems to still be more focused on his base. I think it will be a very important issue in the general election. November is a far time off. If this whole deal is resolved by then, which is highly unlikely, it will work to his benefit. But I think this will be the big campaign issue, and Democrats and Republicans will use it to the fullest extent.
So do you think that's true, not just nationally, but also for voters here in New Mexico? Are we similar or different from the nationwide picture in one way or another?
New Mexico is similar to the nation in the sense that issues relating to access to healthcare, poverty, and the like are the same issues both in New Mexico and nationally. The difference is they're amplified here. We have more issues with access to healthcare. We have more issues with poverty. We have a higher proportion of our population, Native Americans, residing on reservations and pueblos, where this has been a big issue. So the issues are the same, they're just more amplified in New Mexico because the kinds of people who are more at risk from this virus are the same types of people we have a lot of here in New Mexico.
So that what you're saying is we're a minority majority state. We know we have a lot of Hispanics, we have a lot of Native Americans. We know that those groups have been affected in a bigger way by the virus in the number of cases, the number of deaths. So will that affect either turnout or the outcome?
Yes, turnout will be lower in the primary for reasons stated. Turnout will be higher in the general because I think the lines are drawn with this president. Many people love him, many people do not. I think that will bring a lot of people to the polls. But what's interesting is, you know, if you think about the Native American population in New Mexico, they're very loyal Democratic Party voters. Typically, Native Americans are also more concerned with national issues than state issues. And so the only way Trump can turn that around is if he does a bang-up job and pleases the Native Americans on how he handles the virus. The other group that's of great interest is just the whole campaign strategy of President Trump. Their campaign has sincerely targeted New Mexico. They say they're in here for the whole, to the general election. New Mexico has been trending blue in presidential campaigns. Barack Obama won New Mexico twice by large margins. Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump by 8 percentage points here in New Mexico. But yet the Trump campaign is saying they're going to target our state, they're going to focus on Hispanics, They believe that since many Hispanics, although loyal Democratic voters, many Hispanics are more conservative socially, and they think that some of Trump's messages on the border wall, on abortion, and the like, immigration, actually resonates among some Hispanics. So there the issue will be whether the Hispanics will be pleased or not with the Trump administration's performance on COVID-19. They tend to vote Democrat. You know, George Bush, when he won New Mexico, he got 40% of the Hispanic vote. Republican will never win the majority of the Hispanic votes in a presidential race here in New Mexico. But if they could get 40%, that's part of the formula for a victory. So it'll be interesting to see if the Trump campaign can be successful in their strategy to target New Mexico.
So it's not the first time that we're going to be a battleground. We've seen this, been to this rodeo before.
Right,
So,
New Mexico used to be the battleground of battleground states for presidential, and it used to also be a barometer state as New Mexico goes the nation, or vice versa there. Al Gore won it by 300 votes out of 600,000, and when George Bush did win, he won it by 5,000 votes, just a handful. So we used to be a battleground state, but not in the last 3 presidential election races.
but if we are a battleground state, one of the things that's going to be absolutely critical is campaigning. And the virus is affecting how people can campaign. We're used to people knocking on doors and holding big rallies. What's going to happen during a virus?
Well, you know, Donald Trump and his campaign, they're very successful with their rallies. He loves the rallies because they energize him, and they also energize his supporters. So he can't hold his rallies now, and I know that that frustrates him very much. So he substituted them with daily COVID-19 press conferences, which, you know, the ratings are out on how well that's going for him. So that's been a frustration for the president. He can't use his normal strength, which is those rallies. Think about the local legislative candidates or county candidates. Their best means of persuasion is through door to door, shaking hands with the voters, looking them in the eyes and saying, "Can I count on your support?" They can't do that right now. And so local races have to change their strategies. Social media is becoming more important part of the campaigns, more telephone calls, direct mail. So local races also have to change the ways that they're interacting with the voters.
So social media, you brought up social media, and we know that we have the Twitter president. We have a president who is very accustomed to using social media. What's going to happen here in
I'm sorry.
That's all right. What's going to happen here in New Mexico? Is one party more savvy when it comes to using social media and using technology?
I think that, well, first back to the president and Twitter, I think the Democratic Party would even acknowledge that in 2016, the Republicans used social media more effectively than Democrats did, and that it contributed to the president's victory. And he also uses Twitter. With Twitter, you can communicate directly with the voters with no filter, no media filter in between. In New Mexico, I think that both Democrats and Republicans are recognizing that they need to use social media more effectively this election cycle, not only to persuade voters, but also to raise money. You take a sponsored ad out on Facebook, you target it through micro-targeting to a particular group that supports you. They click on the ad on the news feed, it takes them to the website of the campaign or to a fundraising page. And so both Democrats and Republicans are using social media locally effectively. Also, you're able to micro-target different groups through Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms. So it'll continue to become more important as the personal touch is negated due to the virus.
Be interesting to see how all that works out. You mentioned fundraising. And so that's another potential area of challenges, if you will, for this time of the virus, because we have people who are unemployed. They don't have money to contribute to candidates. We have people who used to have a lot of money who've lost a lot in the stock market. What kind of an impact do you see in terms of fundraising?
Democrats have been very successful lately through social media sites like Act Blue, where thousands, tens of thousands of people give $5, $10, $100, and those dollars really add up. That's going to be more problematic now because many people are worried about their own economic situation, job losses, and for themselves or their families. So that's going to be a little frustrating. I think candidates are having a harder time raising money. They're even harder time getting that $1,000 donation because people, again, the business owners, small business owners are struggling. I think what we're going to see is more people, unfortunately, relying on political action committees or independent expenditure committees where you can raise unlimited amounts of money as long as those bodies do not work independent of the campaigns themselves. They don't interact directly with the campaigns. So we'll see more influence from big money, less influence from smaller campaign contributions.
And this is a poor state too.
And this is a poor state, yes.
So switching to another way of getting voters, we've seen in the past that candidates do play politics. They blame each other for what happens. Are we going to see playing politics during a pandemic? Is that something we have to look forward to in the next 6 months?
You know, I don't know how many times the voters have told me they hate the negative ads. As we get close to the primaries or the generals, they joke to me and say they'd like to slit their wrists rather than watching one more negative ad. Unfortunately, they have been effective. If one side goes negative, the other side's forced to go negative as well. But when it comes to the pandemic, yes, we will be seeing negative ads with both sides accusing the other side of not acting quick enough or most effectively. Campaigns will have to be careful. You want to keep away from certain topics. You don't want it to hit below the belt, to tell some lies, or because this is such a crisis that if the ads are not in good taste, they could backfire. So we will be seeing negative ads. They will stretch the truth, but if they go too far, they can backfire.
Fact checking is going to be important again in 2020.
You bet.
So turn to some of the congressional races here in the state of New Mexico. We've got, out of the 3 seats, 2 big races. One is in the 1st district, and that's an open seat being vacated by Representative Ben Ray Lujan. And one is in the 2nd district in the southern part of the state, where we had a Democrat win in 2018, but it's unclear whether or not she's going to be able to hold on to her seat in 2020. What kinds of things are you seeing? How's it looking in those 2 places?
Right. In northern New Mexico, in the 3rd congressional district, we have a very exciting race going on with, I think, 7 candidates. The thing is, this is an open seat. Every 10 years, on average, a seat opens up for the U.S. House. For the U.S. Senate seats, sometimes we go 30 years or 36 years with Domenici and Jeff Bingaman. So when there's an open seat, there's a lot of interest. Now, why is there so much interest in the Democratic side, the Democratic primary? That's because northern New Mexico is a Democratic stronghold. The odds are that whoever wins that Democratic primary in the 3rd congressional district up north will, in all likelihood, win the general election. So that's why all the action's in the primary. We've got some strong candidates. They've got diverse backgrounds. We have Valerie Plame, who has a lot of national notoriety. Teresa Ledger Fernandez, she did very well among the grassroots Democrats at the convention. Marcos Serna has a lot of local name recognition. And we have Joseph Sanchez, John Blair running. A lot of good candidates in that race. So we'll have to wait and see who wins. Some have the money edge, some have the name recognition edge. A lot of money being spent on TV in that race at this time. That's where the action is. The general election for that district will be more boring. In the southern district, the 2nd congressional district, most of the action right now is in the Republican primary, not in the Democratic primary. Yvette Harrell and Claire Chase are running against each other for the Republican nomination. That's an interesting race, and we're seeing a lot of television there. They're trying to outdo each other as to who is most loyal to Donald Trump. And that strategy makes sense in that district, especially in a Republican primary. Whoever wins that primary will go up against Xochitl Small in the general election. Wow, that will be, that second congressional district, one of the most competitive races in the nation, one of the most expensive races, because that is a conservative stronghold that Xochitl Small pulled off an upset 2 years ago. But that was during a Democratic wave. She's going to have to work really hard to hold on to that seat, and time will tell whether she can.
It's going to be one everybody's going to be watching, not just those of us here in New Mexico.
Absolutely, that one will be watched nationally.
Take me back for a second to the third district. Is Washington experience important in some way in that one, particularly during this time of the coronavirus, when there's been a lot of criticism of leadership on the federal level? Are voters likely to look at that and say, we want somebody who has Washington experience? And of course, former CIA operative Valerie Plame does have some of that. I think Teresa Leger Fernandez also worked in the Obama administration. So is that a criteria you think voters might look at?
Maybe, but there are a lot of capable candidates in that race. And I think many of them could make an argument that they have the political background or the educational background or the experience to do well when they hit the ground running in that race. And so far, we haven't seen that as the issue in the primary. We're seeing their ads really dealing more with local issues. I think the issue on competence in Washington will be a bigger issue in the general election and less of an issue in the primary.
I guess that certainly makes sense. And you've got your work cut out for you with the races here in New Mexico. Tell me a little bit about your line of work and whether or not you've been impacted by the virus. Is this making it easier, harder? What's it like for you?
Well, all of our pollers are working at home. You cannot congregate in large groups any longer, but we have the technology to do that. What's interesting, there's been one good thing about this whole virus, the only one for us, and that is more people are at home right now. They're not at work. They're not at play. And so we're finding more people are answering their telephones. We still do random sample phone calls, mostly cell phones. We have a scientific way of doing a random sample and being able to generalize the results to the larger population. And over the years, we've had a pretty accurate track record of doing this. And so what we're finding is we're having a higher response rate and cooperation rate since more people are home and some of them are a little bored.
Those random calls, though, make me think about those robocalls that I'm getting all the time. And most of us have, found a way to at least minimize them. Is that a problem for you, or the fact that people are getting those spam calls?
Yes, it is a problem. As more people spam, then people are less likely to answer any phone number that they don't recognize. We still have ways to help us on that, but not to mitigate it. It's against federal law to robocall a cell phone with an auto dialer, but there are still people who do it and abuse the system. And that does pay a price for us as well, since then people are more reluctant to answer legitimate research calls.
I didn't know it was against federal law. We had another question about pollsters and how you do your work that came from one of our members, Mary Charlotte Domandi of Santa Fe. And I'm going to read to you what she said. She said, do pollsters differentiate between people who care a lot and know a lot about the issues as opposed to those who maybe have just a vague grasp of the issues? And when you take a look at your results, do you weigh one more than the other? Can you do that?
Well, if the objective of the poll is to measure public opinion on a given topic, we count everyone. We count them whether they're extremely knowledgeable or less knowledgeable. And who's to say who's more or less knowledgeable? But we can cross-tabulate the results of any question by how interested a person is on that issue or what their educational attainment level is. And oftentimes we find that people with a graduate degree have very different views or very different priorities than someone with a high school education. Everyone counts equally. but we can segment the results and see what type of person is more interested in a particular topic.
So Mary Charlotte Domandi also asked a second question that had to do with polling, because we see polls, and certainly nationwide polls are showing that former Vice President Joe Biden is in the lead over President Donald Trump. But when you look at other ways of calculating what might happen in the election, we see the betting odds, the folks in Las Vegas who give Donald Trump the edge. Why does that happen is what Domandi wanted to know.
Right, that's because in national polls, in most of the national polls, Joe Biden is ahead of Donald Trump. But if you think back to 4 years ago, in most of the national polls, Hillary Clinton was ahead of Donald Trump as well. But Hillary Clinton did win the national vote by 2.8 percentage points. So the national polls were right. It was the state-by-state polls that were wrong. So the answer to the question is that a national poll can show Joe Biden way ahead, but that's not how we select our presidents. We select our presidents majority or plurality at the state level. And so if Donald Trump were to win Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan and Florida again, he could very well be elected president again, even though he might lose the popular vote, which is what those national polls are reflecting.
So let's go back to the state and to the state legislature in particular, because you've spent a lot of time looking at the roundhouse and what's happening on a state level here in New Mexico. What do you think the political outlook is?
Well, here in New Mexico, the Democrats control both the state Senate and the state House by large margins. 22-seat margin in the House, 10-seat margin in the state Senate. But the state Senate is much more moderate to conservative, even though the Democrats have a tremendous edge. What we should be watching in the upcoming June primaries is the fact that there are 6 powerful Democratic, moderate to conservative incumbents who are being challenged by more progressive candidates. And if those more progressive candidates were to defeat some of the moderate to conservative Senate Democrat incumbents, that could change the makeup of the state Senate. Right now, the state House is pretty liberal, the governor's pretty liberal, but the state Senate's been slowing down a lot of the more progressive agenda. So in a way, just as interesting this cycle will be the Democratic primary, and see if some of these progressive Democrats can successfully defeat some of the more moderate to conservative, powerful Democrats. Time will tell whether that happens.
Time will tell. That's what journalists always say, right?
Right.
But looking at those moderate and conservative Democrats, I think you've been quoted as saying that one thing that will impact whether or not they can win over the progressives is the decline in our state revenues, which of course we've seen because we've seen a huge downturn in the oil and gas industry. So one of our members, it's Elizabeth Flock out of Taos, challenged what you had to say on that score. And I want to read to you what she had to say. She said, progressive ideas like more universal access to healthcare and the instability of capitalism have never had more traction than they have now. So how do you respond to Elizabeth?
Well, first, I truly believe and feel and have observed that these progressive groups that are working really hard trying to take on these incumbent moderate to conservative Democrats, they're very well organized. They run great campaigns. And I think they do have an opportunity to win some of those Democratic primaries during this June upcoming election. I do feel, though, that if you look at some of the Senate districts that are up for this competition, some of them are in places like Deming and Lordsburg and Silver City, Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, Grants. These are not exactly bastions of liberalism. So they're taking on some of these moderate to conservative Democrats in areas that are not the most liberal areas in the state. Also, what happened during the legislative session? The legislature increased their budget significantly. These moderate to conservative Democrats were restrained and saying, slow down here, these surpluses won't be around forever. And here we are a few months later, and it looks like we're going to cut that projected budget during a special session by $1 or $2 billion due to the decline in revenue due to gross receipts and gas and oil royalties and taxes. So some of those moderate to conservative Democrats are saying, I told you so. We have to be careful how we spend our money. Having said that, the progressive organizations are doing a great job, and they have a chance of taking on some of these Democrats in the Democratic primary.
So in a way, it actually does tie back to coronavirus, well, maybe in two ways. Certainly, as you've mentioned, when we're talking about the deficits that we might be running. But also you mentioned grants, and in grants, we've seen the mayor in direct conflict to Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham saying, I'm going to open businesses.
Right, so he's taking perhaps a more cautious or conservative position, and I think he's even a Democrat. And so that might be an example of that. And the coronavirus is hitting New Mexico economically in so many different ways, you know, not only through obvious loss of gross receipts tax, but of course, like the gas and oil circumstance that's devastating us. We rely on about 40% of our government revenue from gas and oil royalties and taxes and the like. And so we have a double whammy when it comes to the impact on New Mexico. So we're going to have a special session probably in the summer after the June primaries. And we're going to have to, the legislators are going to look hard and fast on how to cut perhaps $1 or $2 billion from that budget that they passed just a few months ago. That will begin come July 1st of this year.
It's a lot to watch in the near future. We also have something to look at that's just a little bit further out, and that's this whole question of redistricting. We know that 10 years ago, there was quite a shift in population in the state of New Mexico, and that meant a shift in terms of the representation in Santa Fe. I'm wondering what your prediction is, if you have one, for after the 2020 census. We're all out there filling out those forms, or at least many of us have been filling out the forms. What do you think?
Right. Well, first, it's critical that New Mexicans fill out those forms. Last decade and the decade before, we were some of the most undercounted states in the nation. It affects a lot of money coming from Washington. It affects our representation. So it's critical that people fill out the census forms. It's private. None of that information is shared with government agencies. And so, yes. And the question was, though, on...
The question was on redistricting and
oh yes, on redistricting.
What you're going to post.
Basically, 10 years ago, not only did we experience a lot of population growth, but we also had a distribution of the population where north central New Mexico did not keep pace with the population growth of the rest of the state. So the judge who selected the plan to redistrict the state house determined that where there were 11 state house seats in north central New Mexico, we would only end up with 10. We actually lost representation in the state house in north central New Mexico to the west side of Albuquerque. In looking at the numbers this time, we haven't experienced as much growth this year, this decade, and more importantly, we haven't experienced a redistribution of the growth throughout the state. So in all likelihood, there wouldn't be sufficient population shifts to cost north central New Mexico any additional representation, any losses in redistricting.
So that's interesting. And it sounds like the only way that the virus and redistricting have a connection is whether or not people actually go and fill out these census forms and we get an accurate count. And whether the virus affects that or not, I guess we don't know yet.
Right, and one interesting sidebar is, here we are conducting the census right now. People are this month supposed to be filling out their form. And at the same time in Lee County, you've got many of those oil workers who are losing their jobs, many of whom will go back to Texas. A lot of them live in the Texas area, or other parts of New Mexico even. Will they end up filling out the census form in New Mexico before they leave, or will they fill it out in Texas? So Lee County's population could be impacted actually by the fact that the census count is occurring in this month of April and also in May.
This has given us a lot to talk about between the virus and the political scene. But I have a feeling that for years, maybe decades to come, people are going to be analyzing what the impact was of the coronavirus on the 2020 elections.
Oh, totally. The virus is going to have a big impact on turnout. It's going to have a big impact on November. You know, how long ago was it? Not long ago that everyone was saying that, oh, the general election will just be a referendum on how people thought on impeachment. Well, who cares about impeachment? You know, and that's why we still have to wait to see what happens in November. It's still a long way off and how this all shakes out. But the virus is the big issue for years to come. There's no doubt about it. Plus, we don't know whether we're going to have a resurgence of this virus come the winter, and so many factors are still up in the air as to how the virus will impact us politically.
6 months. And here in New Mexico, maybe a month, a little over a month, and we'll have a glimpse of how the virus might be affecting elections 2020.
Yes.
So Brian Sanderoff, thank you so much for joining us. And thanks to New Mexico Presswomen, the members who submitted questions, and thanks to all of you for watching.
Thanks, Kate. Enjoyed it very much.
Thanks, Brian.